Well, good morning. Like it or not, parent choice is expanding across the states. And we are forced to endure old, outdated funding formulas that are really preventing choice for families. So, how can states begin to align with this shift for more choice? How can they design, think up, simplify, or create new funding formulas to increase parity and adjust for student need? Let's talk about it. But first, I'm Ebony Lee, and I'm Chief External Affairs Officer for the Charter School Growth Fund, and I'm joined by three esteemed panelists. This one probably needs no introduction, but for many of you, anyway, this is Derrell Bradford, and he is the president of 50 Can. Next up, we have Marty Lueken, and he is the director of Fiscal Research and Education Center at EdChoice. Welcome, Marty. And last but not least, our sponsor and convener, Matthew Joseph, Senior Policy Advisor for Education Funding here at ExcelinEd. All right, Darrell. I've shared with the audience what it is that we're talking about today. Can you set the stage and really describe for our audience what's the problem? What do we mean when we say the school funding formula is broken?
Good morning, everybody. Holler. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank Matthew for convening us all on his own, which is also a good deal here. Um, you think people like you, and then they ask you to do something like explain like a huge intractable problem in 30 seconds. Uh, so I'm gonna try to do that. And I figured I would just start with like four philosophical challenges with how we fund how we fund education. I'll just say how we fund education in America, and then my the august assemblage to my left, corporeally, not politically, will help you figure out what those things are, kind of for real. So the first thing is that the incentives are bad, and I want to give it up for Marty here. There's this great saying that Milton Friedman has about how you spend money, and he says there's four ways to spend money. Right? You spend your money on you. You spend your money on somebody else. You spend somebody else's money on you. You spend somebody else's money on somebody else, right? So more often than not, like when you send a kid to your local school, or whatever, you've basically empowered the district to tax on behalf of your kid forever, right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence I think Marty could speak to about how enrollment declines really aren't affecting school budgets, right now. But in the best case scenario, that is someone else's money being spent on you. In the worst case scenario, I think, and what we see most of the time, is someone else's money being spent like on someone else, right? Meaning the district bureaucracy or the sort of adults in the building. So this is completely not optimal, and I think part of what we've been seeing lately. You can look at Idaho, Oklahoma, obviously Texas, and the federal tax credit is the move to let people spend more of their money on them, right? Or some combination of their money and other people's money on them, so the kids get the education they deserve. So that is one big challenge, and that is one thing that we'll talk about during this. The second thing is that the sort of the long-term economic hypothesis of funding traditional district schools and traditional district school districts, it just doesn't add up anymore. So there are these two assumptions that we had, back in the day. One is that uh, quip to what Jeb Bush said last year in his keynote is that people would keep having babies forever. They're not doing that. Enrollment declines, populate, like the student age population is decreasing and has been decreasing for a really, really, really long time. And we don't have finance mechanisms that take that into account. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the hypothesis assumes no competition. Right, so with the shrinking of the Catholic system over the last 50 years, of which I'm a great supporter, basically seemed like we were going to like a one horse town unless you were like incredibly rich. post-pandemic, that has changed dramatically. Like, there are 1.6 million kids in America who are going to public schools they aren't zoned for. The charter school growth is the only public school sector that is continuing to grow right now. Then, the number of Black homeschoolers has tripled. So there are all these other, like there's the microschooling movement. There are all these other interventions, I would say, that present as competition to traditional school districts, and we didn't take that into account. I would just also say that the way we've set up school finance right now, there is no reward for looking for where excellence and affordability intersect with one another. The whole discussion is that the most expensive thing must be the best thing. And I think, look, I've lived in cities my whole life. I only have a license, but I know that there are these things out there called cars. And you don't have to buy the most expensive car to have a completely functional car, right? And I think schooling has a similar analog here. In today's headlines in Chicago, there's a school that has 28 kids in it because everybody else has left, and they are spending $93,000 a kid. So that is the inverse. I didn't make that up. That is the inverse of finding affordability and access at an intersection. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that we penalize kids for choosing schools that they aren't zoned for. Um, so right now, if you want the most money that the state can give you to go get educated, you have to go to the school that your house is attached to. And I don't blame anybody for that. Like, and I'll sort of get to that later. But everything other than that, you get less. So if you choose a charter school, you get less. If you decide you want a tax credit, you're gonna get less. If you decide you want to homeschool, you might get nothing, right? And so the moment you don't take the default assignment, you become a second class citizen of school finance. And I think that is also hugely problematic. And in any one of those places, even though you're getting less, someone will still argue that you are taking money from the traditional public schools. So I just want to throw that out there too. Now, there's a debate going on with some of my friends, and not just me, but sort of like a sector-wide debate about whether or not you actually want a scrappy, low-cost sector, right, as a way to sort of promote innovation and like show efficiency and all these other things. At 50CAN, we've sort of argued, I think what ExcelinEd would think, that a student is a student is a student, and we should be thinking about ways to have all the money follow the kids wherever they go. And there are some real innovations on this happening across the country right now. Indiana, Colorado back in the day did shared mill levies. Like we're seeing more people open up more access to public finance to more different kinds of schools, and I think that is also a very good thing. And then the last one is that the current school finance regimes actually bring out the worst in us. So I've written on this kind of extensively about the intersection of school finance and school zones, like school attendance zones, and the root of school attendance zones. Now, listen, I started this with a quote from Milton Friedman. I'm not going to pretend like incentives don't matter, right? So, and I believe that most Americans are acting perfectly rationally when they're like, hey, my school is bundled with my house, right? That is the intellectual paradigm we have set up, but it is built on ground that is not that was not tilled in the best moments or in the best spirit of the American experiment, right? You can look at the homeowners loan corporation stuff. You can look at the maps of redlining. I grew up in a district that is redlined. When you read what they said in the map, it said too many Negroes, too many, right? Not even just a lot, too many, right? So these things, these are not our finest hour. And then we layered our system of school finance on top of those things. And they have given us schools that are more segregated by race and income now and opportunity more than they ever have been. I think it's time to have this conversation about whether or not we want to continue this sort of like shotgun marriage of housing and schooling in a way that sort of prohibits more choice and more opportunity and could ultimately bring us more together than keeping us apart. So thank you very much.
So, Darrell, I think if I were to sum up, you would say that the current funding formula is neither rational nor efficient.
I think that's well said.
Thank you. Okay. So, Matthew, I'm going to turn to you and ask probably an unfair question, but how could one funding formula change the game, level the playing field, and help all students, regardless of their school type? What would be the components of such a system?
Thank you, Ebony, and thank you, Derrell. That was fantastic. I'm going to steal the second-class citizen on school finance from you in the future, because I think that's really what we were thinking about at ExcelinEd over the last year. My colleagues and I thought really hard about like let's take a step back. And if you weren't just inheriting the school funding system that's existed, piled on top of layers like an archaeological site, what would be that school funding system that was more rational, that's more for the future, for the next 20 years? And we did start thinking about like if what you want to have your school funding system do is drive your theory. If you're a state policymaker and you believe in a certain way to improve outcomes for students, you want to have the school funding system support that. You don't want to have it undermine it. So if a state is saying we believe that an important driver of improved student outcomes is parents getting to choose the best school for their own children, then how would you design a school funding system that is consistent with that, that supports that, that enables that? And Ben DeGrow, a colleague of mine, and I, we put out a blog earlier this year, and we talked about just exactly what Derrell was talking about. It does not make sense to have a system which is biased, that is basically telling parents, we trust we trust you to make your decision. But if you choose the decision that we like, or a certain decision, you're going to get $20,000. But if you choose another decision, you're going to get $10,000. And another decision, you're going to get $5,000. That's really not supporting the parent. That's basically saying to the parent, we really want you to choose the $20,000 option. And if that's not what the policymakers don't want to pressure a parent in a certain direction. What they would do is they would have a neutral system. And so that's what we think about when we think about one formula. It wouldn't be like one formula for students in traditional public schools, another formula for students in charter schools, which is half the same, but a little bit different, very complicated transitions from one sector to the other. And then when you go to the private schools for the scholarships, it's a completely third formula that's not even related to the first two. And so that's what's causing this kind of disparity. And so instead, if you just said, we're going to have one formula and it's going to be agnostic as to what school type that you go to. It's $10,000. You can take it to one school or another, but we're not going to basically say that you are being penalized the way Derrell said if you choose one or the other. That does not mean a state can't make a distinction to say, well, we really want the science of reading to be implemented, so we're going to have more funding for students who are K-3. That's perfectly fine. Or it's going to be, we really want to fund students who are in certain high valued career programs. All those are fine, but they would still be agnostic about the school type. In other words, you would still get that bonus for a K-3 student, whether or not it went to one place or the other. So it's a very complicated world that we live in. But ironically, we're saying in school funding that simple is the best. Collapse all these complicated formulas, just have one that is across the board. And then you eliminate a lot of the disparities that Derrell's talking about.
So, Matthew, you talked a lot about disparities and the possibility of getting to neutral or to be agnostic. So, I'm going to turn it now to Marty and say, what do we even mean when we say parity in funding? And why is it important in this conversation?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Matt and ExcelinEd, for putting this panel together. Let me first ask folks in the room, how many of you know how your state's school funding formula works? Like, raise your hand. Wow. Okay. Um, that that's a lot.
Dangerous room.
It is. It is. So it's basically probably the whole population in the U.S. came here. Um, for those that don't, or when you hear funding formula, if you feel anxious or maybe hopeless, well, I do have good news for you. There are 3 people in your states that do understand, and probably they're all here in this room, it seems. So, but but when you talk about parity, talking about how to tweak the funding formula, parity broadly, or parity in base, means portable funding according to student need, right? Where each student receives a base amount of funding plus some add-on or weights or additional funds for certain characteristics or circumstances. For example, students with disabilities, English language learners, gifted students, students from low-income families and areas, et cetera. So you have students that have higher need for education, and so they're receiving that as well. So when you have funding parity in K-12, then a student's funding is going to follow them, as Matt talked about, to whatever setting they choose, right? Regardless of where they enroll. A given student will generate the same amount of funds of for education, whether they enroll in a micro school, a charter school, a district school, hybrid homeschool, whatever it may be. Now, parity is important because it matters for students, right? Um, so a unified system of funding, what that's doing is that signals that the state is committed to equality of opportunity for the students. That a child's opportunities, they don't depend on the kind of school or the sector that they attend and enroll in. And more importantly, I think that those opportunities also don't depend on where a student lives, as Derrell was talking about. So parity through a unified system of funding, and portability, where all the dollars follow the child, that buys two things, important things. So one, it's transparent. It's easy to understand. Right now, there are states that have uh, over the years, that they've had funding formulas, and they've had these tweaks and fixes and band-aids on them, over the years, and in some places they look like this big old Frankenstein monster, and it's really doesn't make sense, and it's very, very difficult to understand, right? And so having this simplified system, unified system, is going to make that more transparent, not only for the folks that you know deal with these funding formulas and figure out where the dollars are distributed, but also for taxpayers and for parents, as well. So that's going to be important. Um, they're also accountable. So if any school doesn't serve a child sufficiently to the parents' liking, then that child can leave. And a system where a school loses those dollars tied to that student, that's a very strong incentive for schools to rethink what they're doing, to rethink their operations and how to serve that student better whenever they are losing students. And indeed, research supports this idea that schools, to an extent, they do respond when they lose students, and they also respond when choice enters the picture. And when the cost to them is greater, then they also respond greater too. Um, there's also a supply side uh, component here too that I think is really important, where you're increasing access, funding a universal K-12 system like ESA programs in Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, and other states. What we're seeing is that builds supply, that incentivizes innovation, and that's also increasing access to various educational opportunities for families and kids. And so, when states differentiate funding according to need, um, they incentivize these schools to serve students, especially students that might have challenging circumstances and may need more support. And when states fund all students across all sectors, they're incentivizing new education providers to also enter the marketplace and also serve students according to need. And so we've been seeing this kind of supply response, in some of these states that are growing these programs, to all, and opening options to all families in their state. And so basically, this is a way, I think, that state you can modernize your funding system for K-12, where you're saying that every kid counts the same, every dollar counts for the child, and that schools, earn those dollars by serving those students well.
Thank you, Marty. I just want to give the audience a heads up after this question that I'm going to ask. If you have questions, feel free to come to the mic. So, Marty said that when we think about parodying funding, we want to think about it being portable, kind of based on student need. Darrell, in your first response, you said a student is a student is a student is a student. So, Marty also said that states have now devised these funding formulas and they're like Frankenstein. So my question is, did little Johnny change when his family made a different choice? Did his needs all of a sudden become different? So I want you to argue for why it's important to actually adjust or supplement funding for student needs.
Why does it have to be an argument? So I will assert that,
Fair enough.
that I do think this is one of the things that is kind of absent to the discussion outside of modernizing a traditional district school funding arrangement, which is waiting for student need. So, there is a burgeoning discussion about like why we don't have weighted ESAs. Like we probably should. Like one of the things you always hear about like tax credit scholarship programs or voucher programs or something is that like, oh, well, you won't, it's only $6,000. You won't take any kids with special needs. It's like, well, you give the district $36,000 to take a kid with special needs. Like it's a difficult, kid to serve. Like, why don't we support somebody's right to serve that kid, right? So we've already accepted this in the district context. It is worth accepting it in this new context. But what I do want to point to is when we say like a student is a student is a student, it that little troika is important because it emphasizes that the thing that should not change is the student or the student's right to an education in an environment where the education happens can change much more frequently than it has normally.
Matthew, you look like you wanted to respond to that. No? Okay, I'm going to turn it to the audience. Please state your name, your organization, and everyone with me, ask a question.
All right. My name is Dan McGuire. I'm a state rep from New Hampshire. So I just came from the accountability discussion, so that's still on my mind. Should there be an accountability component to funding of EFAs, homeschoolers, choice, charter schools, whatever? If they're getting good math reading test scores, they get more, otherwise less, something like that.
Sam, you were in my notes. So, panel, what about accountability?
It's a great question, and I think that, what we have thought about is there is a continuum of accountability. The answer is yes. But the amount of the accountability, the structure of it does depend upon the extent to which that school type is a monopoly, in which case we want to have a little more strict accountability versus there's a lot of competition. This is about parent choice. They can so easily take their child away from that school that we can count a little bit more on that economic, that incentive structure to basically say, as long as the parent knows about the performance of their kid and the performance of their school at school, they're going to take it away. They're going to take their children away. So I guess the answer is yes. I think the question becomes, for example, like, do we want to even have some of the money attached to performance? And, I think the answer is that we believe yes, that if there's success with a student, if they succeed after they leave high school, that yes, there should be some bonus amount. But the core part of it really is about the accountability for the results. And that's why you were probably in the right panel, because the best form of accountability is that A to F grade, but mostly oriented, if it's more of a monopoly, like the traditional public school, let's make sure that there's more information, as opposed to at the other end of the spectrum, you have private school choice and you can have a little bit less. And of course, charter schools are somewhere in the middle where they kind of have some of the accountability of the traditional public schools and more of the freedom.
Thank you.
Just quick, isn't New Hampshire's live free or die, right?
Absolutely.
It's a good motto.
Mhm.
All right, so I just because this is actually incredibly important, and I'm happy you raised this thing. So there's this thing. This is not meant to sound flip. It will sound flip, but it's not directed at you. There is this thing called federalism, and it means that in New Hampshire, if you would like to try this, you should try this, right? You should figure out how to do incentives-based funding or rewards-based funding or whatever it is that reflects what is important to you in your state. I would just add to this that the greater discussion is like, what do we mean by accountable? So Matthew's thing about like regulating a market and a monopoly differently, I think is incredibly important. And we're moving to this system where like when you go to monopoly, you're trusting parent more, you're taking a step back from the state, like kind of over and over and over again. And that's like a different way to think about it. But I would argue, and I say this as somebody who was ride or die for NCLB for a very long time, that I don't think we really have a system of accountability right now. At most, we have a system of transparency. We can tell you a lot about what schools are doing poorly, but we don't do much about schools that do poorly. And to your point on results, normally the worse you do, the more money you get, right? And we're arguing that we should do exactly the opposite, and all like the worse you do, the less money you should get. So I think this is a wonderful, timely, trenchant, really important discussion to have. But I just wanted to highlight all that as some additional color.
Thank you.
Marty?
Yeah, and just to add on to that real quickly, that if you move from this top-down based accountability to market-based accountability, where parents are deciding and you're putting all the power in the parents, the other important component too is information. So for market-based accountability to work, you need good information, and that information needs to find its way into the hands of the parents.
So you guys have talked a little bit about more information, accountability of outcomes, and kind of marketplace accountability. My follow-up to Sam's great question is, will schools actually use resources more efficiently with this type of accountability?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question because I think what we have found is that when schools have more flexibility, but are held accountable for outcomes, you do see improved outcomes. It's just one of those things. I mean, most people do believe that the people closest to the school have greater ability to make those decisions. And in fact, the more that the state is micromanaging those inputs, the more they have an excuse to say, you can't hold us accountable. You told me what to do, so how can you hold me accountable for outcomes? So I think that this is one of the actual advantages of a system like this, is that it frees up policymakers at the state level to not get involved in all the details about what the schools are using the money for, and focuses more on outcomes. And is there a good strategy for the state to improve reading? And what is the alignment between the strategy and the resources? It becomes very big picture and not on the micro details of what's happening in each school.
Yeah, I just, Frank Lloyd Wright has this great design axiom, which is that less is more and less more is better. And I do think we've operated from the standpoint that more is always better, right? And so there is no incentive to find efficiencies in an environment where more is always better. That said, like to Matthew's point, you can look at charter school world, right? That is, I mean, the like private fundraising notwithstanding, you do see environments where less has given you significantly more, right? The highest flying CMOs on a per dollar basis are getting you like outrageous efficiency for student achievement. I think there's a universe of school districts. They tend to be like blue collar rim districts normally. So like they have the student body pressures of sort of cities, but not the tax bases of like incredibly wealthy suburbs. And some of them actually squeeze out very high gains in an environment of high efficiency. So I think there are examples of this. The question also though is efficiency what you want? Like I would take significantly more achievement for the same amount of money versus the same amount of achievement for less money, right? Like that. That's also a trade-off. If you want to spend less money, that's a different conversation.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege here on behalf of all the charter folks in the audience and say, I think a little more money would be helpful, and despite all of the uh, outsized outcomes. Okay, next up.
This may help you on what you're just talking about. I'm from Pensacola, Florida, Camden County School District, and
What's your name?
Huh?
Your name.
Kevin Adams. And next year, now I don't know how it's going to work yet, but what we're going to do is offer out some of our services of our school district to those private kids that are taking the vouchers. So if they want to participate in our orchestra, we're working out a formula to do that. So we're a choice county. We got 76 academies. We got magnet schools. We know how to make A schools. We're still working on the level 1 and 2 students, with the community partnership schools to provide them all the resources. But that's what the impact of the voucher been to us. Now, what I'm trying to convince legislators is break the chains off us where we can really compete. And that's the tough part right there. And the transportation component is another hard one because we have magnet programs where we have to do trunk routes and the kids have to pick it up to get to, they want to attend this, because they can attend any school that has capacity to go to that magnet program of that academy. So unfortunately, if the bus is full and you only got 10 more kids, well, they can't come from that area. So, but anyway, so that's what we're doing over in Escambia County to meet this new competition that we have to do. We want to compete. So hopefully the legislators will let us compete. Also, states that are planning on giving vouchers out across the board better come up with a database that tracks everybody by social security number, not student IDs. But you're going to run into some big problems like we have in Florida.
I would just say I'm incredibly supportive of this, by the way. The public schools participating in a more diverse universe of pay, I think is like a critical piece. I work a lot with charter school folks who want to service ESA families, that kind of thing. I think the gradual blurring of the lines around all this is really important, and is the product of a school finance system where a student is a student is a student.
Does anyone have any reactions to his comment about transportation? No? Agreement? Okay. Next up. Name and question.
Hi, Rihanna Saslow from the National Parents Union. So during the ECA negotiations, there was in the Big Beautiful Bill, there was a very brief moment when all participating schools were required not to discriminate against students with disabilities. And that was very quickly taken out. It was described as a poison pill, it was described as an unfunded mandate, and it did not make it into the final version of the bill. So, my question is if schools of choice are to access the same levels of funding as traditional public schools, should they be required to serve the same students as traditional public schools? And if not, why?
Yeah, so we do see states like Arizona and Florida where, and Ohio is another, that the choice programs they've had programs for decades, and students with disabilities represents disproportionate, large portion of of the students that participate in these programs, and parents are happy with it. With these programs, they're very happy with them as well, and so. But I think the key though, as I mentioned before, with the funding, you need to get the funding right. And that's why weights are really, really important. And for students with disabilities, because there's such a wide spectrum of severity for various conditions and needs and whatnot, it's also important to get that right as well. Ohio is an example that they do it pretty well. They have a program that's for autistic students only, and I think the voucher amount is like 27,000, or it might be $30,000. It's probably more than that right now. And so that's you know a bit of popular program. A lot of students are in that program, and one of the reasons is because that state is differentiating the funding. But but when you do that, you're changing the incentives. You're incentivizing schools to be able to serve them. Because if you have a program where there's some states that have a flat amount for the ESA voucher or whatever, and often it's below the amounts that are usually allocated to students with special needs. There not only is there an incentive, but not to serve those students, but it's cost prohibitive for schools to serve those populations, and so you need to make it so it's not cost prohibitive for them.
I'm going to push on you just a little bit because we actually, so at National Parents Union, we speak a lot with parents individually. And we actually had a family in Ohio reach out to us, and their child was expelled from a private school in Ohio, and they had nowhere to go mid year. No school would take them. And so, even though they had funding at that school, theoretically, to educate their child, that school was still able to discriminate and expel their child with a disability. And so, I'll ask the same question. So, should schools, if they receive adequate funding to educate students with disabilities, be required not to discriminate against those students?
Well, it is. So one thing I just want to say is that it's some of the first private school choice programs are passed for kids with special needs. So there's like a long Florida McKay, Carson Smith in Utah, a couple other ones. So that's what we're thinking about. The second thing is that the record of public school districts not accepting kids with special needs is egregious. And I think my good friend Tim DeRoche has chronicled this extensively. So the question of appropriate fit and supply for kids with special needs when properly funded, I think is a good one, but not one that is unique to only independent schools. So that's the second thing I want to say. The last thing I want to add is just like because this is really important, this discrimination thing. So I went to an all boys high school. Uh, does anybody know what an all boys high school does? Go ahead. Discriminates against women, right? So I highlight that only to say that there is a difference between what a school gives you when it assigns you by your address, which by all data that we have right now has given us schools that are more segregated by race and income than they were pre-Brown, um, and a school that you have the option to attend that is trying to build an intentional community. And I just think that's a really nuanced and good and productive conversation to have about like how we create new environments and how we match, right? Like peer effects, like peer matching, I think is a very important thing that we don't talk sort of enough about. But certainly the challenges of special needs kids in placement are serious and should be taken seriously.
So I want to actually follow up a little bit and ask the panel, what should be the categories for higher need students, right? To warrant additional or different funding in this new formula. And is there an approximate amount or weight that we should give to these categories?
I can talk about it a little bit. I mean, the most common categories are, first of all, you start with students with disabilities. I mean, most people understand intuitively that these are students who have IEPs. They are those indicate certain services, they cost extra money. And if you're telling a school that if you take a student that let's say they have dyslexia and it's going to cost an extra $5,000, you need a specially trained teacher, you need assistive technology, you might need tutoring, it's going to cost thousands of dollars extra, but you get the same amount of money, then I think that is a disincentive for that school to even suggest to that parent that they should enroll. They're going to say, well, we don't have the services. We don't discriminate, by the way, but we do not have the services really to treat your student all that well, but there's a student down the street. So I think we know that there's that category of student, but I think there's also other categories that are really so similar that we think of them almost bundled together as academically at risk. And that's English learners, for example. It is students who come from lower income backgrounds. Those are categories of students that if we don't have the right kind of weights in the system, then the incentive structure is to make it so they have fewer choices. And so it just makes sense. And you're thinking about it from a market perspective, like what would be the extra amount of money so that schools would be proliferating who are specializing or all offering those services. And you can do the average. I mean, the average is going to be like 25% more, for a kid with dyslexia. But I think it's something that states need to constantly monitor and say, well, is there a problem with access that's happening? To not lock it in all the time, but to start with those three categories and then have the amount of money be approximately what like you see other states are doing, and then adjust it if you see like there are problems with access. There is a supply problem. There is a survey saying that parents aren't able to find the schools. You can always adjust those weights or add your categories.
Name and question.
Yep, thank you. My name is Samantha Fett. I'm a state representative from Iowa and on the education committee. We have a great universal ESA program that just went universal this year. So very excited about that. But my question to you is when we talk about funding for universal school choice, and we really want to stimulate the market for innovation, right now we're struggling with capacity and supply. And so we certainly don't want to pass legislation that would ever stifle the growth of that. We just talked about students with disabilities and all boys school. We want all different types of models, whether that's public, private, public charter, homeschool, microschool, hybrid, or something else. We want them all. And if we really put parents in charge, they have the opportunity to make all of these choices. So, talk to me a little bit about there's some talk about um, limiting the funding for ESAs, putting a cap on it. And I'm hearing that across the country. And I want to make sure, I want to hear your comments on how that would be very detrimental to this program. I mean, 50% of the United States has a choice program. Students have the opportunity. So this is the future. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Wants to take this one? Marty?
Okay, I'll step on that landmine. And by the way, I've watched Iowa from afar for a very long time. I remember I gave a speech at like a school choice week event in like the museum with the airplane hanging up at the front once. So like, and you have a wonderful state capital. I congratulate you on your success. So I would just say, here's the thing that is most important to remember. I guess in 1991, I think is what it was, something happened. Does anybody know what happened in 1991? The first charter school opened. That's right. The first charter school opened. So like, I don't know, five, you know, entrepreneurial, risk-friendly kids decided to go to this brand new type of school that had never existed any place in America. And now here we are, right? There are 3.1 million kids, 200,000 teachers, and 7,200 charter schools across the country. I think that's what the number is. The numbers are. So, but that took a little while to germinate. Here's what would have made that really difficult to do. If somebody said, we're going to wait for this one charter school to run for like 100 years and then make a decision about something else, right? So I highlight that to say that I think this pressure is unique to elected officials, because nobody wants to be, I say this all the time, nobody wants to be above the fold on a bad story on Legos, right? I mean, like, I don't know, Legos are like the ninth circle of education funding hell now, is kind of the thing. So nobody wants to do that, and I appreciate that that is a real pressure. I would urge everybody to give this burgeoning movement, which is a revolution in school finance, which is happening alongside other revolutions in school finance, including the modernization of current formulas, tax credits, tax credit at the federal level, refundable credits in places like Idaho. All of this stuff is kind of happening at the same time. We gave charter schools at least 5 years. We haven't really given this 5 minutes, right? So I would just say that, supply doesn't generate in the absence of all of in scarcity, right? Like we want to stimulate a real response. I think the cross sector, take on these things really matters. So to your point earlier, one way that traditional district schools offer choice is through magnets. I'm very supportive of magnet schools. We should be incentivizing the growth of magnet schools, right? Charter schools know a lot about recruiting enrollment and trying new things and building board members and reporting on accountability. Like they can help the independent school sector, right? They can help the private school sector. We have lots of private schools that, have lost kids because of cost, not quality, right? They can bring kids back in. So I just think there is a lot of dynamism in the market that is untapped. But the most important thing is the courage to let a revisited system take hold again. And I do think that reducing ESA amounts is a challenge to having that happen. And I thank you for everything you guys are doing out there.
I wanted to add something about that just because the issue of caps is coming up in states because of the fact that they have multiple funding formulas. So if students are dropping in one area, it affects one part of the budget. But if they're increasing in another part of the sector, that part is blowing up the state budget. And so if you had one formula and people were just moving from one to the other, and it really didn't matter to the state budget, they're going to go from one to one to one, then you don't have a problem of having to have caps. Now, one of the issues in the one formula idea is like, what about all the other things other than the state formula that's there that are driving these disparities? What about all the local dollars? And so what states are doing is sometimes replacing the local dollars with state dollars, and that does add money. That does make it so that the parent is the same, but the state is taking a hit. And so that's why over time, states need to figure out, how do we make it that the overall change from sector to sector of one formula means that all the money is going, all the different portions of a formula are going over sector by sector. They're all neutral. So it is all neutral to the state budget. So we don't have to have caps. Like we don't have caps in states that say, well, if more parents move to a certain school district, well, we're going to cap that. We're not going to fund them, because the formula does adjust. It does know that there's going to be a certain amount of students moving from one part of the state to another. And it doesn't say in the budget, we're going to cap it. So if it is, if you do have one formula that is basically agnostic across the board, then it should be neutral for the state budget. And so we shouldn't have to have this phenomenon of having to restrict choice because it's blowing up one portion of the state budget.
Marty, did you want to add before I follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, in Iowa, it's a very rural state. I would point to other states and other examples as well. So Florida is a really good example of where you're seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of amazing things going on. And I don't know if Ron Mattis is in this room, but he writes on all the different schools that have been opening. And there are teachers also like from public schools that have just been disillusioned and you know, it's been very challenging for them to kind of operate in, in a system that is very uh, inflexible and whatnot. And so it gets to your point, right? Make that, but some teachers have gone and opened up their own schools as well, and I think that that's a good thing. But I think pointing to the examples of showing where you know, the response is happening. Because another thing to keep in mind too is that this isn't going to happen overnight. It takes time. Florida, Arizona, they've been around for decades, and they have very rich K-12 ecosystems that they've had for a long time as well. So they have the benefit of that. So it's just a matter of giving it time.
So I want to follow up on something you said, Matthew, and this is the idea that the state budget would be neutral, right? Um, what else should be included in the base? Because there's local funding, there's also federal funding, there's facilities funding. Like, help this audience think about being neutral with these other funding sources impacting that neutrality.
Well, it's a great question, and I know, like, Marty does a lot of thinking about this, and I think we're actually continuing to think about what does it mean. I don't think we've entirely figured out like what should be in the base. I mean, it's pretty clear that if the base only means what you would look in the state formula, that what they call base, that really is not going to be helpful as much for parent selection, because someone spoke from the great state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire, 2/3 of the money is not in the state formula. It's outside the formula. It's what the localities, live free or die, they're raising all that money. And therefore, the state, if they just did their base, it would be like $3,000. But meanwhile, the traditional public schools are spending, 5 times that amount of money. So I think we know that it has to be somewhere more than what the state is saying, just the state portion, because we do have a country where there's shared responsibility for taxpayers, for state and local. The state says the state is responsible for education. No, there's no doubt about it. But then they have devolved financial responsibility as a collection, a joint responsibility with locals and with local taxpayers and the state sources. And so parity, from our perspective, probably means that, at least from the local taxpayer perspective, is that their obligation is to be neutral. I mean, they're going to raise money for the education of the students who live in their area. That's perfectly fine. But they can't then say, well, then we're going to tell you that you paid your taxes, but you can only choose option A. That's the part where it just doesn't make any sense. So how much else should be included in the base? How much of it is, well, first of all, the federal rules aren't controlled by a state, so we can think about that. Should there be facility funding? All that is stuff to think about. But I think the goal is, honestly, to get as much money that is currently going into the traditional public schools to be part of the base, so that basically there's no discrimination for a parent. There's no financial penalty if they choose a school other than the one that is right across the street, which they may not think is the best choice for their students.
Marty, do you want to add? And then
Yeah, I think the question here is how much more can you make a current funding formula more student-centered? And so most states, I think it's like 37 maybe, they do have foundation student-weighted funding formulas, but how they operate effectively varies greatly from state to state. And so I think a good first step, just from a practical perspective here, is to audit and do a scan and analysis of the funding formula, and then figure out like what parts are actually driven, are in the formula and based on students, and then what parts of funding and what funding streams are based on non-student characteristics, categorical grants and local funding that's not feeding into the formula, or parts of that, and things like that. And then that's your starting point, and then you can figure out like, how can we consolidate? How can we move, these non-student based streams into the formula? How can they feed into the formula? And so there are lots of different ways to do that. there are different opportunities to do that. Indiana had in 2008 had a big funding reform bill where they had a tax swap, and they basically shifted a portion of the local funds that fed into the maintenance and operations, and they shifted that over to the state portion, and so that fed into the funding formula, which was funded solely by state dollars. Local dollars is a separate bucket completely, and so after that, 2011 passed the voucher program, which is tied to the funding formula. That reform helped to make the voucher program and the amount more student-based and operate more effectively. So you had more students participating in the program as well. So there are lots of different things. It's a very technical question, technical issue, but it is doable.
Thank you. I'm Brad Paquette from the state of Michigan. Great state, still struggling in education. Former teacher as well on the education committee. Education reform is my life. But when we talk about funding for universal choice, we often are about talking about funding to choose a school. I wonder if any on the panel have thought at all or played around with the idea of allowing parents to choose teachers directly. If you want to talk to that in any capacity, because we lose teachers between 3 to 5 years. The only way to make more money in education is to teach longer. And so a lot of our best teachers leave the classroom and they're not being paid what they're worth. And so I wonder if you guys have played around with the idea. Some energy there. Go ahead.
The answer is yes. No, I think it's a very exciting idea. I'm going to build on some model policy that ExcelinEd had called a charter teacher. Was that what it was? Where like a teacher could stay in the state pension system, state benefit system, but sort of teach independently. I do think that if you told 10 families they could use their ESA to hire a teacher that was going to teach, that their kids, right, like be aligned with what their thoughts and values were and what's aspirations for their own children, and found ostensibly an itinerant educator who wanted to do that would be that would be a gangbusters type thing. Like I think lots of people would want this under those conditions, and I do think that the ancillary benefit is, look, I'm on the board of a charter school network with very large class sizes in the elementary schools. It ain't for everybody, right? But some people excel at 10 families, that kind of thing. And the way we've set things up, kind of normally, is that if you can't excel above 10, then you leave, right? And you don't make enough money and all these other things. It would be nice to be able to feature people who excel at 10, again, as a part of a diverse delivery system, and now hopefully a growing sector of teachers again, because I think everybody knows this number of people staying in the profession has been going down, particularly since the pandemic.
Did one of you guys want to add on that? And I think we saw evidence of this happening during the pandemic. Lots of parents with means would do exactly that with their pods. So it'd be interesting to see what would happen in the public square. So I know we're getting close to the end of time, but I want to focus my final questions with you guys on the policymakers in the room. What are some incentives, if you will, for states to actually test this out? Are there some just initial steps that folks leaving this room or leaving this conference today could think about going back to their states and sharing?
I have a couple. I think you guys also will have some ideas. And I think about like states where they do have weights for certain students. They do. You look at them, and that there are extra funding for a certain type of student, but only if they attend one of the sectors for, say, the traditional public school. And that is just an obvious thing. Why would you give an extra $2,000 for an English learner only if they attend the traditional public school? But if that parent goes to the charter school, they lose that $2,000. If they go and they use a scholarship to attend a private school, why would they lose that? Why can't you just have the same weights? Just so easy. You've already done the calculation. You've already justified it for one sector. And the second is, we've talked about the notion that schools are losing students, and the states policy's normal inclination is to say we're going to hold those schools and school districts harmless. We're not going to penalize them because they still have all the same costs with one less student. But the reality is that the expected declines because of just birth rates in some states is 10% over the next 10 years. And so to have all those schools held harmless, basically neutralize them from the effect of competition in anything, is really harmful, for there to be competition. And so I think one of the things states can do that have those provisions, they can at least make them temporary to say, if you have a shock to the system and your enrollment drops by 5% in a year, we're going to help you step it down. But we're not going to say, if you're not offering the services, if parents don't want to come to your school, we're going to give you the same amount of money as if you did have all of those students, because there's a lot of other things a state could do with all that money that's being freed up. There's a lot of strategic priorities, like to actually, like Texas does, pay teachers more who work in certain environments. I mean, there's nothing about having one formula that says a state can't have its own priorities on the science of reading or effective teachers. It just means that they're not discriminating by school type when they do that. They say, yes, we're going to do this, and it's going to be the same regardless of the type of school that a student is attending. But to park 10% of your money as if all those ghost students are there is something that I think at least should be a conscious choice that state policymakers make.
I was going to also add to and use Missouri as an example. So Missouri can make some tweaks to the formula that I think could help it operate better. One of the things with Missouri's formula is that the dollars today are based on 2005 property values. And as property values have changed over time, what has happened is that the formula has become more regressive rather than progressive. And so you have these funding gaps between wealthy and poorer districts widen over time. And so just making that small change would go a long way to help. But that's because that's a problem and a big complaint of a lot of districts, especially like St. Louis and City, that they're receiving a lot fewer funds than the neighboring districts that are the wealthiest in the state.
So I will give you none of that. I would just say, I know that everybody in here is trying to solve. If you hear you're interested in solving one of the hardest problems of education, right? Which is like how to fund it, right? There's a lot of systems built into it. Again, that, like I said, they're the incentives of housing and all this other stuff. So like jazz musicians used to call New York the Big Apple because they'd say there are many apples on the tree, but there's only one big apple, right? Soon to be the free apple. So I highlight that to say that like this is that thing, right? So I want to acknowledge that. You got to figure out what you want to do. That's the first thing, and you got to look at other states. That's the second. So let me give you like a quick example on this. So I can remember about like very, very, very early in my career, I worked on private school choice in New Jersey. I know I like to tilt at windmills. And we looked at the education tax credit program in Pennsylvania. And that program is basically a way to build buy-in between local businesses, local schools, and local people, right? So that's sort of how it worked. But that wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to use the tax credit as a way to help low-income kids who were at the time zoned to some of the most highest spending, lowest performing school districts in the state and indeed the country, right? So that is an example of like a policy that presented itself in two very different ways in states that were right next to one another. If you look at the passage of ESAs over the last 2 or 3 years, Utah and Arizona are very like wild, wild west, but many of them along the way have said, we want more data, we want more testing, right? Like, so like Georgia, Louisiana have said, hey, we're not going to mandate the state test, but we're going to mandate a test, right? So I highlight that to say that all of these things are changing along the way, and you need to figure out what you want to happen in your state with those changes. Now, to your point of earlier, which I thought was a really good one, and we talked about this in our prep call, the question of like public school regulation really does live right alongside of this. I'm incredibly sympathetic to it. Like I ran a panel with a bunch of electeds in New York like a few years ago, and one of the guys is a big school choice supporter from the Bronx. He said, every year I vote to increase the school budget. We put $1 billion in the top. We still don't have toilet paper in my district. Why is that? Right? Like these are real questions that we have to like talk about, inefficiencies, opacities built into these systems that enable all sectors to compete. So I'm incredibly sympathetic to this. But I think every state has to figure out what it wants with a system of universal choice. Do you want to be the one where it's like, hey, if you come here, you get the education that's right for you? Do you want to be the one that says if you come here, every kid is going to go to college? Like we are a state of high achievers, and that's what we do. That is a question only you can answer in your local context with your colleagues. I think you've come up with a very strong answer for that. It becomes a lot easier to look at other states and decide what you want to do after us. But I don't want to dismiss how hard this is, right? It's the Bonnie and Clyde thing. It's where the money is, so it's not going to be easy. But I do think the time to do it is probably now.
Well, we've reached the conclusion of our panel today. Please join me in thanking Matthew, Marty, and Derrell. Thank you, guys.